We live in a time when the world seems to have lost its collective mind. As a consequence, more than a few things previously thought to be more than stable are starting to wobble. And this means we need to ask ourselves some pointed and difficult questions. What is going on? Why are these things happening to us? I want to submit that we are in the dire condition we are in because Christian parents have for far too long ignored numerous cautions, admonitions, and warnings with regard to the education of our children. The issue of Christian education as obligatory for Christian children is one that needs to be pressed home now more than ever. Back in the 80s, a few far-sighted thinkers were telling everyone to make sure they kept a fire extinguisher around. Now that we have a towering inferno going, the admonition comes back to mind. Few realize that the greatest commandment found in Scripture, the requirement to love God with all that we have and are, Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, is a commandment that comes to us in a passage that is talking about the education of covenant children. Moses required parents to bring up their children in an environment dominated by the Word of God. You shall teach your children the law diligently, the law which addresses all of life, and you are to do so when you are sitting in your home, when you walk along the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. In short, the instruction was to be constant, ongoing, and all-encompassing. If adults are expected to love God with all their heart, soul, and strength, Deuteronomy 6:5, then they will first need to learn how to start doing this when they are children. When Jesus applies this commandment, Mark 12:30, he adds an additional aspect to our love for God. He says that we are also to love God with all our minds. We are to love God with all our brains, in other words, and we learn how to do this in the process of what we call education. And when it comes to the education of our covenant children, the Old Testament and the New Testament speak with one voice, appealing to exactly the same promise. In the chapter prior to the one just cited above, we find the second giving of the Ten Commandments. The fifth commandment is the one requiring children to honor their parents. And we should remember that these parents are the ones who in the very next chapter were instructed to bring their children up, surrounded by the words of Jehovah. Honor thy father and thy mother, as the Lord thy God hath commanded thee, that thy days may be prolonged, and that it may go well with thee in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Deuteronomy 5:16. This commandment is addressed to Israelite children gathered around the base of Mount Sinai. They were told that if they obeyed this commandment, then God will prolong their days in the land which God was going to give them. And centuries later, the apostle picks this commandment up and quietly applied it to Gentile children in Ephesus. And he explicitly stated that the promise was still good. The promise is greatly expanded, in fact. Quote, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live long on the earth." Ephesians 6, 1 through 3. Here the promise is expanded to include Gentile children, and the promise is also expanded to include the whole earth, which, remember, the meek will inherit. So just as in Deuteronomy, the command with a promise is followed by a requirement that godly parents provide their kids with a Christian education. The identical pattern is followed here in Ephesians. Paul brings up the fifth commandment, and right after that, he says this to fathers. "And ye, fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord." Ephesians 6:4. One of the words underneath nurture and admonition here is the Greek word paideia. To understand the importance of this, we have to distinguish between different kinds of nouns. We have nouns that refer to everyday items, things like salt or shoelaces or chair or keyboard. But we also have nouns that refer to large concepts that are very important to a culture's understanding of itself. A noun like this for us would be something like democracy. Because of this importance, you wouldn't be surprised to find in a library somewhere a 3-volume set that was entitled Democracy. It would be the kind of work that had lots of footnotes, and you might even think that 3 volumes might not be sufficient. But if you also found a 3-volume set entitled Table Salt, a historical review, you might think you'd come across an author with a serious personal problem. I began using this illustration years ago because I have in my library a 3-volume study of the word paideia. And this is fitting because paideia described for the Greeks the entire process of enculturation. What did it take to incorporate a child just born into the ways, customs, laws, morals, and worldview of his people? What we call education was just part of this process. And thus it is quite significant that the Apostle Paul instructs Christian fathers to bring up their children in the paideia of the Lord. Now, if paideia is the process of enculturating children into the entire culture of their people, for Paul to tell parents to provide a Christian form of this means that he had the establishment of a Christian culture in view. This process works in the other direction also. If a largely Christian culture, which is what we once were, absent-mindedly drifts into an acceptance of a secular paideia, then it will just be a matter of time before they wake up and find that the culture they remember from their childhood is entirely gone. We are in that position now. The rampant paganism that we see around us, manifesting itself in countless ways, is a paganism that came from somewhere. And the answer to this puzzle is that it came from the schools. The culture of one generation is the culture that was instilled when that generation was in the process of being educated. This is not to single out the schools as the solitary culprit. There were other players, obviously. One large contributor would be the entertainment industry, for example. The ancient Greeks would have included the plays put on in the amphitheater as part of the paideia, alongside what was being learned in the course of formal academic instruction. And so in the same way, what a child is being taught by his secularizing teachers is reinforced by the catechism of his Spotify playlists. One of the reasons that Christian parents neglect this very plain instruction is that they've been encouraged to believe that epistemic neutrality is a possibility. In other words, they imagine knowledge as a neutral kind of intellectual nutrition, like a bowl of cold porridge. It is all pretty nondescript. 2 + 2 = 4. Water flows downhill. George Washington was our first president. All non-controversial and therefore neutral, right? No, not right at all. The idea is that knowledge is somehow neutral and that all worldviews share this common ground of neutral knowledge. All the children come to the secular government school in order to receive their neutral porridge, which they can then take home so that it can be flavored according to taste. The Christians add milk and brown sugar, the Muslims add mustard, the Buddhists add curry, and the secular atheists eat it cold. The problem with this picture is that knowledge is in no way neutral. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Proverbs 1:7. Ultimate commitments matter, and they always have an impact on the details of what we think we know. How can 2 and 2 make 4 if 2 and 4 are all Maya, illusion, as the Hindu believes? How can we add and subtract when all is one? What many people falsely describe as neutral ground is actually the residual consensus of a formerly Christian world. That world was largely in the West, but as a result of the age of exploration and colonialism, the assumptions of the West were largely and gradually adopted everywhere else in the world. This happened while the Christian foundation in the West was being eaten out by the termites of unbelief, and also while the Western-style house was being built on sand everywhere else. Matthew 7:24. This was clean contrary to the Lord's teaching on this very subject, and it is not surprising that what we just assume as quote-unquote neutral knowledge is actually residual Christianity, but Christian assumptions that are no longer gratefully acknowledged. At some point, they might be acknowledged after they're completely gone, on the assumption that you don't miss your water until your well runs dry. Neutrality is not possible. Moses told the people that God had delivered them from bondage in Egypt, Exodus 20:1-2. And Jeroboam told the people that the golden calves at Dan and Bethel had delivered them from Egypt, 1 Kings 12:28. So it makes a difference, does it not, whether Moses or Jeroboam writes the history curriculum? When Congress approved the final language of the First Amendment, the terms of which have been twisted to mean that our federal government is supposed to be radically secular, that same day Congress established a day of prayer and thanksgiving. It makes a difference who writes the history curriculum. And secularists like to say that in keeping God out of the classroom, they are not teaching anything about him, one way or the other. But in keeping him out of the classroom, they are, in fact, inculcating a very pernicious error, which is that of teaching the children that if there is a God, his existence is irrelevant to what we are doing here in this classroom. He therefore becomes something of an add-on extra. But of course, if the living God of the Bible is actually there, he is nothing at all like an add-on extra. He would not be just one additional fact in the universe of numerous facts. Rather, he would be the everlasting and eternal fact. He would be fact itself, upon which every other fact must rest. This is another way of saying that if the Christian God exists, his existence is not a trivial thing. His existence charges the world with meaning. And without him, we would just have a meaningless cataract of atoms banging down through history, and hence no way of trusting our thoughts, as they were part of this cascade of atoms, and thus we would have no reason for trusting our thought processes, made up as they are of rushing atoms. And that means we have no reason for believing them to be made out of rushing atoms. In short, in the folly of attempted neutrality, we have made everything meaningless. Our schools, our lesson plans, our graduation requirements, the lot. We are just meaningless bits of protoplasm sitting behind desks. In order to build anything straight, it is necessary that the foundation be straight. And the scriptures teach us that the foundation of all knowledge and the foundation of all wisdom is the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Proverbs 1:7, Proverbs 9:10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding have all they that do his commandments. His praise endureth forever. Psalm 111, verse 10. And what is the goal of education? The whole point of education is to gain knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. This being the case, then what foundation must our schools be built on? Our schools must be built on the fear of God. We sometimes speak of the issue of quote-unquote prayer in school as though it were a separate issue, not connected to everything else. It was simply one of the controversies back in the day, and so we still tend to think of it as a standalone issue. But it was more like the question of whether or not concrete in earthquake zones should have rebar in it, or whether houses on the beach should have deep footings that go down to rock. I can still remember prayer at the beginning of the day in the government school I attended as a boy. Whatever the quality of the prayer, it was still an acknowledgement on the part of the school that we are not gods and there is a God above us. This is not an acknowledgement that the educators of the present day are still willing to make. This is not a complicated point. We have only complicated it for ourselves through our reluctance to do what it takes to provide a thoroughgoing Christian education for our children. The government schools are free, we tell ourselves, and this is much more of a selling point for us than it ought to be. But in a broken world like ours, free things often turn out to be attached to a hidden price tag. It is no different here. That hidden price tag comes at two different levels. One is that instead of tuition payments, we all pay an exorbitant amount in our property taxes, but the money still goes out. But the real cost, the second thing, is one we are just now starting to realize in the lives, souls, minds, and bodies of our children. So the point is a simple one, and that point remains constant. Christian kids must receive a Christian education. One, what is the source of much modern cultural craziness? The source of this craziness is that our system of education has sought to teach students how to live without reference to God and His Christ. As a consequence, they don't know how to live. Two, where in the Old Testament does it require godly education for covenant children? This is required in Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9. 3. What is highly significant about this passage? It is the passage of the Old Testament that contains the greatest commandment of all. The command to love the Lord your God with all that you have and are is a command that is nestled within the context of instruction on biblical education for covenant children. 4. Where in the New Testament does it require godly education for covenant children? This is required in Ephesians 6, 1 through 3. Fathers are instructed to make sure their children are brought up in the paideia of the Lord. 5. What is significant about this word, paideia? It is the word that was used in that world to describe the entire process of enculturation. What we call formal education would simply be a subset of this process. 6. What was the promise given to the Israelite children, and to whom was it also given? The promise is part of the fifth commandment, which requires us to honor our fathers and mothers. In the Ten Commandments, the promise is given to the children of Israel, and the promise is that life will go well for them in the land that God was giving them. Centuries later, Paul picks up this promise, expands it, and applies it to Gentile children in Ephesus, saying that the promise was that life would go well for them in the earth. 7. What has been the role of the schools in the deterioration of our culture? Schools are the place where the next generation is prepared to take on the role of the next generation. And if this generation is burning everything down, then we should ask where and how they were educated. 8. What is the nature of the error that has led Christians to remain in the government schools? The error can be described as the myth of neutrality. This is the assumption that bare knowledge is neutral, shared in common between all worldviews, while the things that distinguish different worldviews are added to that raw knowledge as though they were condiments. 9. What is one example of the myth of neutrality in education? Moses told the people of Israel that Jehovah had led them out of Egypt, Exodus 20:1 and 2, while Jeroboam said that the golden calves at Dan and Bethel, 1 Kings 12:28, should get the credit for the deliverance. So it makes a difference whether Moses or Jeroboam writes the history curriculum. 10. What is our answer to the secularists who say that they just impart basic knowledge in the government schools and that they don't say anything one way or the other about the existence of God? The answer is that they are making a huge claim about God. They are teaching a subject, and by implication, they are saying that whether or not God exists has no relevance to the subject the students are studying. 11. What is the end of the road if we seriously try to live out a pretended neutrality? The end of the road is meaninglessness. If we act as though God does not exist, and if we teach students to try to understand the world without reference to Him, then the necessary end of that line of reasoning is that there is no point to anything. 12. What should the starting point for every form of education be? The starting point for true education must always be the fear of the Lord. Without that, accumulation of disconnected pieces of information will be nothing but vanity and chasing after wind.